everybody. This is Ronnie from Alliance for Justice. I just want to let you know that we're going to get going in about a minute or so. I see that people are still signing on, so I just want to give them a moment to get themselves situated. Okay, so it is 2 minutes after the hour, so I think I'm going to get going. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ronnie Puelko, and I am one of the counsels with Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy Program. For those of you who don't know us, we are a team of attorneys that works with nonprofit organizations to help them understand the rules of advocacy. We put on webinars such as the one we're going to see today. We do in-person trainings, and we also have a website where you can download a whole range of resources that address all the types of activities that nonprofits want to engage in when it comes to advocacy. We also have a technical assistance hotline. You can give us a call or email us, and we will help answer your questions about advocacy. With one caveat is, while we can help you understand the rules and laws that apply to nonprofit organizations, we cannot serve as your attorneys. However, we're always happy to talk through your situation and let you know basically where you stand with the law. So for today, we're going to be talking about advocacy and lobbying for 501c3 organizations. I'll be about an hour presentation, and this is being recorded so you can always look back to it at another date. If you have any questions, there is a chat box. All you need to do is type it in, and I will do my best to get to your questions. And if I don't by any chance, I will take a look at them and get back to you over email. Or you can always just reach out to us at our technical assistance hotline. Go to our website, boulderadvocacy.org, and you'll find our contact information there. And Andres, are you there? I'm afraid he may have gotten knocked off. Let me just one moment before I get going. Oh, there he is. Did you want to start?
Hello. Absolutely. I'm actually going to turn my webcam off. I have a slow internet connection. I just wanted everybody to see my face before I continue talking, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off webcam here. My name is Irs Esparza. I am the Grassroots Engagement Director here at the Conservation Lands Foundation, And I'm very excited to be kicking off this first of 4 webinars focused on advocacy and lobbying as a land-based nonprofit in this very special 2020 election year. I think it goes without saying that advocacy, community support, and grassroots organizing is critical and vital to all the good that we are going to be doing as a movement. But this year, it's especially important for so many reasons that we engage our communities in the civic political process to elect representatives who are going to care about communities and land. So again, this is the first of 4 webinars focused on what it means to be a 501c3 based in conservation and how you can meaningfully and carefully and legally engage in the political process. Something that I want you all to keep in mind as we move forward all of this today is that we all already do advocacy. When we get families out on the land, when we go and give talks about the importance of special places, when we have a bookstore that sells books on photography of nature, that is all advocacy. That is getting people engaged with landscapes. What we're going to be focusing on over these next 4 webinars is how to maximize all that, how to be as effective and efficient as possible, and how to make sure that when we want to move beyond just connecting people to a landscape, we do it in the right ways. And when we talk to our boards, our staff, our directors, we all know what we are and are not allowed to do, and how really it's a part of what we do. We should be doing this already. And if you want to step up and do more, we're here to help you out. I don't want to give the presentation. Ronnie's going to be giving it. However, I do want to quickly introduce one of our folks here. It is David Feynman. He is our Government Affairs Director. He'll be popping on at the end to help answer a few questions and maybe connect some of the strategies and ideas we talk about today in this webinar to specifics in our Friends Grassroots Network. And just like Ronnie said, this isn't a one and done webinar. This is the beginning of a conversation of how we can all engage in more meaningful ways. So if you have any follow-up questions, if you want to know more, you can always reach out to us. Our job, and mine specific, is to support the Friends Grassroots Network and our partners to do the work that needs to be done. And we can only know what you all need if you let us know. So I'm going to step back here and I'm going to turn it over to Ronnie to go through, and David and I will pop on at the end to go ahead and answer some questions and help manage some of the questions that you all send in through the chat box. All right, Ronnie,
Great.
It is all you.
Great. So let me just get my slides advancing. Okay, so we're going to talk today about what it means to be a 501c3 organization, the definition of advocacy, the definition of lobbying and how much you can do as a 501c3, how to use the lobbying exceptions, meaning how to maximize the law to really engage in the most advocacy that is allowed to a 501c3. Oh, and number 5, we are not talking about keeping safe in an election year. That's an agenda from a different presentation, but that will be covered in one of the future webinars that we'll be posting for your groups. But just, one point, as a C3, just keep in mind, you can't support or oppose candidates for public office, and that really is the best way to keep safe in an election year. And tune into one of the future webinars, and we'll give you a lot more details on how you actually can engage in advocacy during an election year and continue to talk about your issues. And so this chart lays out the most common types of nonprofit organizations. Now, as I understand, all of you are 501c3 public charities, meaning you're tax exempt and contributions to your organizations are tax deductible. Now, the tax law actually does mean fewer people are deducting their contributions now, but this is still a really favorable tax status. And because of that favorable status, there are certain restrictions on what 501c3s may do. Most importantly is you cannot support or oppose any candidates for public office. And when it comes to lobbying, you are absolutely allowed to lobby. However, there are limits on how much you may do, and we'll talk about that. 501c4s, this is also the same column 501c5s and c6s, which are trade organizations and unions fit into, are also tax-exempt organizations, but they cannot receive tax-deductible contributions. So there's fewer restrictions on what they're allowed to do. Importantly, they're allowed to engage in unlimited amounts of lobbying, and they actually can, depending on state or federal law, engage in some election-related activities where they will be supporting or opposing candidates. It has to be a secondary activity, but they are allowed to get involved in elections in ways that C3s may not. And then the far right, I've got 527s, which are most commonly called PACs or political committees. They're also tax-exempt organizations. They rarely lobby, although sometimes we do see them tying lobbying to an elected representative's re-election. And generally what they do is they support or oppose candidates for public office. So taking a look at this bottom line, particularly now during the midst of a really hot election season, is you'll see that while you cannot support or oppose any candidates, many of your C4 partners will be able to engage in election activities. And with 527s, that's all they're going to be doing. So I think when it comes to your social media, you do need to be slow down a little bit, particularly if you're following C4s, which I know a lot of C3s engage in advocacy with C4 partners, because many of them are going to be talking about candidates in ways that you cannot. And as I said earlier, just make sure that you tune into some of the later webinars where we'll be talking about what you may do to talk about candidates and elections. But just be careful is that you do need to be cautious that you don't retweet things that C4s are tweeting about supporting or opposing any candidates for office. And so what is advocacy? Well, I like to say that all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. And so this chart, if you look at what is in green, these are all the activities that 501c3s can engage in unlimited amounts to promote their causes. We've got partisan political in red because that is absolutely forbidden, and lobby in yellow because yes, you certainly may, but just be cautious that you don't exceed your limits. But there's so much activity that C3s can engage in to really engage their communities and promote their causes, including things like changing corporate behavior. I think it's something that, particularly for people who live in states where the politics may not be favorable for passing their issues, you certainly can engage in a lot of activity to really encourage corporations by engaging the public to put pressure on them to change their ways, even if the government isn't forcing them to do it. And of course, as Andre said, educating the public, organizing communities are all really important activities and aspects of advocacy. So these are also all the types of activities that you can do in unlimited amounts without having to worry about exceeding your limits when we're talking about the activities in green. And so important to know that public charities, which is what 501c3, many 501c3s are. So you may lobby. The IRS gives you two different options for tracking your lobbying. There's first the insubstantial fault test, which is the default, or the 501h expenditure test, where you elect to track your lobbying by your expenses. The easy way to find out if your organization does this is, well, first just ask, but it's also, if you look at 990s, which is the annual tax return that 501c3s file, is there, it is indicated on that form how you track your lobbying. We actually like the 501h expenditure test for many organizations because it has much clearer rules as well as clear and set limits on how much you may do. It really is an individual determination though. And so under the insubstantial part test, the default, we have a rather broad definition of lobbying, which is contacting legislators or urging the public to contact legislators to propose, support, or oppose legislation, including the government's budget process. And that's on any level, state, Congress, or even the local level. Or even more broadly, advocating the adoption or rejection of legislation, which is pretty broad. The reason we don't really like this is because the IRS hasn't really given us clear definitions on how much is allowed. So we know from IRS rulings that 5 to 6% of your annual expenditures is probably okay. But that's why we really prefer the other method, which all you need to do to use that is to file a one-page form with the IRS where you just check a box and tell them that you are going to be tracking your lobbying by expense. And so that is the 501H election, which has two different types of lobbying, much like the insubstantial part test. There's direct lobbying, which is a communication to a legislator, which expresses a view about specific legislation, and grassroots lobbying, which is often the most effective. It's a communication to the general public expressing a view about specific legislation. And it includes a call to action where you are encouraging members of the public to contact their elected representative to tell them what they think about the issues. And that's why it's so effective. And so under this 501H expenditure test, you track your lobbying by expense. This chart really is just an illustration that shows that while you may engage in a lot of lobbying, still your primary activities must be education and non-lobbying advocacy. It is a mathematical formula that you use to determine how much you can spend on your lobbying. And that actually is really important. If you have volunteers who are lobbying for you, there's no expense, so no trackable lobbying for the IRS purposes. And so you come to this calculation on how much you may spend by looking at your annual expenditures. Your first $500,000, you can spend 20% on lobbying. And of that, 25% can be grassroots lobbying. And as your expenditures increase, there is a sliding scale down that you can spend. Once you have a budget of $17 million, you're capped at $1 million in lobbying expenses. And I know that there's a lot of involved to this, so we have on our website a lobbying calculator that will do the math for you. If you just Google Boulder Advocacy lobbying calculator, you'll be able to get to that little tool that will help you understand how much you can engage in lobbying. And we use it here at AFJ so that so we don't have to do the math ourselves. And so getting to the definitions of what each of these elements mean, a communication, whether it's direct or lobbying, is really any way you can think of communicating. Sitting down with a legislator, tweeting, texting, calling, writing letters or postcards or signing petitions, even something creative like projecting things onto the Trump Hotel, which is one of DC Advocates' favorite pastimes. Now, I don't think that this is a lobbying message because it doesn't have, it's not directed specifically at a legislator, but it is a good example of a communication. So any way you could think of communicating, is a communication. And definitely people are really creative when it comes to coming up with ways to express their message. A legislator is anybody who is elected to a public office. It includes people in Congress. It also includes their staff. So keep that in mind. If you are engaging in a lobbying communication to a legislator staff person, they are the eyes and ears to that legislator, and so it does count as lobbying. So lobbying applies to people in Congress, to your state legislators, county boards of supervisors, city council and staff, and their staff. And when it comes to ballot measures, I know that many states have ballot measures. In that case, members of the public are voting on legislation, so they're actually acting as legislators. And your advocacy around ballot measures is considered direct lobbying because members of the public are acting as legislators by voting yes or no on a specific measure. A legislator can also be the executive. Now, the executive has two different roles. They have their executive function as well as legislative functions. So governors, the president, as well as mayors, when they are participating in the formulation of legislation or signing or vetoing it or proposing budgets, They're acting in their legislative capacity. And in those cases, your communications with them will be considered lobbying. There are also executive functions, which I'll talk about later, that are not lobbying, but not legislators. And this can be useful for a lot of groups. Our school boards, zoning boards, housing authorities, sewer and water districts, and other special purpose bodies, which is not very clearly defined in the law, but it's generally some sort of subset that is not a lawmaking body. And here's an example: the National Park System Advisory Board, which does not set law, but does actually advise on the national parks. If you're engaging in advocacy before them, it's just advocacy, it's not lobbying. So that's a good example. Expressing a view about specific legislation. So expressing a view means, exactly what it says. It is expressing whether or not you think something is good or bad, whether you think it should be passed or not passed, signed or vetoed. That would be expressing a view. Specific legislation is anything that's been introduced, so it will have a bill number. It includes the budget, but it also includes people who need to be confirmed to their position by a vote of the legislature. So we have a picture of Brett Kavanaugh here, who is, I think most of you would know, is a Supreme Court justice. During that period when his confirmation was pending in the U.S. Senate, he was basically a piece of legislation. So all of the advocacy that went into supporting or opposing his confirmation was lobbying, because during that confirmation period, he was essentially specific legislation that the Senate was, voting yes or no on. And the same thing on the state level. There are many positions where a legislative body votes yes or no on someone's confirmation to a specific position. If you are engaging in advocacy to support or oppose someone's confirmation, then you are engaging in lobbying activity. It can also be specific legislation when it's not introduced into your state or in Congress. Most commonly, this is when you see a model bill that another state has passed or an organization has drafted. But it can also be if you go to a legislator and you have an idea that is so well fleshed out, or that they could essentially put it into a bill, then you would probably be best in treating that as lobbying. There's a little bit of fuzziness around when it becomes lobbying and when it doesn't, but we think that most people should be err on the side of caution. And if you think that you are really talking about a piece of an issue that really is so specific that it could be put into a bill, then treat it as lobbying. And if you ever have questions, you can always give us a call and we'll help you figure out, whether or not you actually have kind of crossed that line into lobbying. Here's just an example. City Council passes, well, here's one. A City Council passes a resolution. Now, resolutions don't have the force of law. However, they are voted on. So if you were encouraging the Seattle City Council to pass this resolution, then you actually engaged in lobbying. Now, I know sometimes if you are really active in the legislative session, you may or may not want to spend your lobbying limit on resolutions because they don't have force of law. But of course, there's certainly other reasons why you would want groups to do it. But just keep in mind, if it is being voted on by a legislator, even if it doesn't have force of law like a resolution, it should be tracked as lobbying. But not specific legislation, and this is where you can do a lot of advocacy, are regulations, executive orders, enforcement of existing laws, and litigation. And I will cover each of these ones separately. So regulations, advocacy on regulations, where you are commenting regulations, signing on to other groups' comments, and encouraging members of the public to submit comments. All of that advocacy does not count as lobbying. And right now, especially on the federal level, this is really important advocacy. under the rules of creating regulations, the government has to respond to all of the comments that are received. And so by encouraging people and writing your own comments, you actually are, forcing the government to respond to what you are saying. It's a great way, particularly when regulations are being proposed that are really harmful, that you can actually slow the process down by submitting a lot of comments that need to be addressed. So this is a great advocacy opportunity for groups to really get out there and make sure that their views are heard and addressed by the government. Administrative advocacy also, once the comments are enacted into the regulatory code, that also does not count as lobbying. So here's a tweet from Food and Water Watch in Virginia, where they're calling for a stricter regulation of greenhouse gases. You can call for new comments, or you can call for the existing regulations to be properly enforced. And all of that is just advocacy. It's not lobbying. Now, I mentioned the executive has an executive function as well as a legislative function. Both governors, the president, I think maybe even mayors in many cities have the ability to issue executive orders. In this capacity, the executive is not acting in their legislative capacity, but their executive capacity. And advocacy around executive orders is not lobbying. So if you're in a state that with a governor that is friendly, you can encourage them to issue executive orders that may accomplish a lot that may not be accomplished through the legislative process. And none of the advocacy that goes into advocating to support an executive order or even writing it, showing up, having rallies is not considered lobbying. I think when it comes to the beginning of new administrations, it's also really important because that's when executive orders are either renewed or repealed. So there's definitely, I know in 2020, if we have a new president, there's going to be a lot of advocacy around existing executive orders. So keep in mind that your advocacy around having executive orders repealed or kept in place does not count as lobbying. Working to change the enforcement or working to just have the laws that are in existence enforced, once again, is not lobbying. So lots of advocacy opportunities to really encourage the government to use the laws that exist to protect the environment. And so moving on to grassroots lobbying. Remember, it's a communication, but to the general public as opposed to a legislator, expressing a view about specific legislation. So those elements are basically the same as in direct lobbying, but it also includes a call to action. If you don't have a call to action, you haven't engaged in grassroots lobbying. And you can actually get really creative by leaving out a call to action to really maximize your advocacy. Particularly useful in the early stages of an advocacy campaign, or if you have spent your lobbying limit already, you can leave out the call to action. And so a call to action is one of four things. It is telling people to contact their legislator. It's providing contact information such as an address, telephone number, or other contact information, including a Twitter handle. I know lots of advocacy is happening on Twitter lately. So if you tweet at or provide a Twitter handle of a legislator, that would count as a call to action. It's providing a mechanism to enable communication, most commonly patched through calls or those email action alerts that you can get on your phone. It can also be petitions, postcards that you provide to people. It's really any way to help people contact their legislators. Or we have an indirect call to action, which is identifying a legislator who will be voting on legislation. You can identify the sponsor of a bill, and that doesn't count as an indirect call to action. But Susan Collins, think of Susan Collins, who is frequently undecided on how she is going to vote on any particular issue. So let's say the Affordable Care Act is up for repeal again, and once again, Susan Collins is undecided. If you put out a communication to the public that said, tomorrow the ACA is up for repeal and Susan Collins is undecided, that would count as a call to action because you're identifying a senator or elected representative who will be voting on that bill. So that counts as an indirect call to action. So here's an example. Sustain our hunting and fishing traditions. Tell Congress to permanently reauthorize. So by saying tell Congress, you are telling people to contact their legislators, and that counts as a call to action. And so this would be a lobbying communication. I think if you are going to do a call to action, you might as well include another and give a contact information and make it easier. Once you have one call to action, you can put 2 or 3 other, ways to contact your legislator and make it easy for people. Here's another example from the state of New York where they were doing a lot of advocacy on Twitter. They are telling people to contact their New York State leaders, and they're giving their Twitter handles so that people can directly reach out to these legislators who will be voting on this bill. So that's a good example of grassroots lobbying through Twitter by tagging people with their Twitter handles. Just an example of one of the mechanisms. So this is also a call to action. So, you would get this on your phone, just fill in your information and hit send, and you have contacted your legislator. So it's really an impactful way for advocacy groups to really encourage members of the public to express their views. But if you don't have a call to action, it's not lobbying. And this is where you can get really creative. So not calls to action are words like learn more, take action even, support our efforts. Or you can direct the action to you to build up your list of supporters by saying get involved or join us. And that's not lobbying. So here's an example. I know it's not your issue area, but I've always loved this ad. I think it's really effective. So this was from the state of Maine when advocates were trying to have passed a paid sick days bill. So they've got this flyer, which they plastered all over the cities, and provide some information about the bill. Basically, she'll be your server tonight. She's pretty sure it's contagious. And it ends by saying support LD 1454, the paid sick days bill. Now, that is not lobbying because there is no call to action on this ad. It's highly effective, though, because it really is educating the public about this issue and the bill that is out there to solve the problem. I think it's a great example of, early stage advocacy where you first inform the public, but then you get further on in the legislative session, you've built up support, you've educated the public, and then you include the call to action. So here's an ad from the same campaign. Once again, they provide some information about the problem and the bill that is the solution. And they end by saying, contact your legislator and share your support of LD 1454. And so that's the call to action. And that is what turns this ad into lobbying. So I think it's a really great example of how you can be creative and start with advocacy and then, basically flip the switch and start lobbying. Here's another one on lobbying. Trump wants to cut the EPA budget. Tell Congress to reject the proposal. Yeah, and then there's a little URL that would take you to one of those take action pages. So that's 2 calls to action, and that's lobbying. So this one counts as lobbying. I know a lot of times people say, how do we track Twitter for lobbying? The easiest thing to do is, someone had a graphic artist put together this ad, that person would track their time. And then if you're paying staff to retweet, just come up with a reasonable estimate of how much time they spend in a week or a day and have that added to their timesheets. But here's an example of how you can be creative. The same ad where it says, tell Congress to reject the proposal, you can turn this into not lobbying by saying, same thing, Trump wants to cut the EPA budget, we need to take action. And that is not a call to action, because you're not telling people to contact their legislator, you're not naming anyone, and you're not providing that little URL that will help them take action. And as I mentioned earlier, if you are working on ballot measures, members of the public are acting as legislators. So there is no grassroots lobbying with ballot measures. If you're engaging in direct lobbying, if you make some form of communication to the public that expresses a view on the measure. Definitely in many states, there's a lot of important public policy issues that get voted on by the members of the public. So just keep in mind that all of these, the take action does not matter. If you are expressing a view on a measure, then you are probably engaging in direct lobbying. It's definitely allowable for C3s, but you do need to track it towards your lobbying limit. But lobbying exceptions, and these are really useful. Now, these apply to both groups that do the insubstantial part test, as well as those who are using the 501H expenditure test. And I will treat each of these separately, but quickly, they are nonpartisan analysis, requests for technical assistance, the two that I think are most useful for most groups, and then the other two which are less useful. Nonpartisan analysis is basically a study of, or a look at an issue. It has to be a full and fair discussion, meaning it's not just an opinion piece. It's really where you look in depth at a specific issue. If it's broadly disseminated, you may express a view about specific legislation. You can even include an indirect call to action where you mention, like Susan Collins or somebody else who is undecided, and you don't have to track it as a lobbying expense. So this is really useful. Generally, you know that this is a nonpartisan analysis if it really is an in-depth look. Generally, it has a cover, there's footnotes to document the sources of your information. And so this is a really useful way to really look in depth at a policy issue, to provide the information that members of the public and legislators need to make up their minds about a specific issue. It really can't, a good rule of thumb is if someone who was your opponent reads this and could come to a different conclusion than you, then you've probably met the full and fair discussion prong of this nonpartisan analysis. Now, if you use this subsequently for your grassroots lobbying, just make sure that your non-lobbying use is greater than your lobbying use. But this is generally a really great way for advocates to really look at an issue in depth and not have to track the whole thing as lobbying. The other one, technical assistance, is when you are invited in writing on behalf of a government body, committee, or subdivision, and what you're providing is available to all members of that government body, committee, or subdivision. You may express a view about specific legislation and not track it as lobbying. This most typically comes up is when you are asked in writing to testify and provide your expert input onto a particular pending issue that a legislative body is grappling with. It doesn't count if it's just like, one political party that is asking, or if it's just one member of the legislature. So say, it could be the environmental committee that is looking at studying an issue, and you are an expert on that area. You may be invited in writing to provide input or guidance. Sometimes I see it where units of government even ask an advocacy group to help them draft legislation. And once again, as long as you meet these elements of being asked in writing, then you don't have to track it as lobbying. And so this is really a great reason to build relationships with legislators as well as relevant committees and regulatory bodies that deal with your issue. This one you probably will not see, but we include it just because it is there. You don't have to count self-defense as lobbying when you're engaging in direct lobbying. It must be a legislative issue that relates to your powers and duties as a nonprofit organization, your tax-exempt status, or the deductibility of contributions. Because this is so rarely used and seen, we think that before you go ahead and engage in advocacy without counting it as lobbying, you probably should consult with an attorney just to make sure that your assessment is correct. And then the last one is basically examinations and discussions of broad social issues. There, you don't mention specific legislation. It's usually things like annual reports, the early stages of policy development, or just a study. You cannot include a call to action, including an indirect call where you mention a legislator who is sort of undecided on the issue, like my favorite example, Susan Collins. But you certainly can do studies that look at issues without having to track it as lobbying. If your activity doesn't have all the elements of lobbying, then it's not lobbying, it's just advocacy. And of course, keeping in mind, you certainly can and should engage in lobbying. I'm just looking to see if we have any questions, and I don't see any. Now, all that I was talking about were the IRS rules that, really govern what is the definition of lobbying and how much you may do. What you will find on the federal as well as the state and often local level is that there are disclosure laws. Sometimes these actually have broader definitions of lobbying. So I know on the federal level and in many states too, regulatory advocacy, so where you are, engaging in advocacy before an administrative body must be reported, but it doesn't count towards your limit. 1 second, let me drink. So just keep in mind, sometimes once you reach a certain threshold, you will need to report your lobbying to a state or federal level, depending on where you're lobbying. And of course, that means you do need some system to record your lobbying. Most organizations use some form of timesheet just to track, what they're doing and how much they're spending if they are doing the 501h election. You do need to report to the IRS how much you spend if you're doing the expenditure test, and you need to report your activities if you're under the insubstantial part test. Things that count are, of course, any staff time that goes to lobbying or preparing to lobby, but also direct expenses, including photocopying, handouts, leaflets, even if you take a taxi or an Uber to the Capitol lobby, that would count as a lobbying expense. And so I have reached the end of, I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. That's the end of this presentation. A little bit more information about us. We have offices here in DC. That's where I'm located. We have an office in Dallas, soon to have one in Houston. We also have offices in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Our California and Texas attorneys are fluent in their state laws, but you can also find on our website information on a little over 30 state laws. So you can find that on our website. I've got our website address as well as our phone number. So definitely reach out to us to ask your questions. We're always happy to answer questions about whether something is lobbying or how you can respond to what candidates say. Pretty much anything that comes up, we are happy to try to help you figure it out. Every now and then we may tell you you actually need an attorney, but that is, we often serve as sort of that gap between when you need an attorney and when you just need to figure out whether it's lobbying and how to say what you need to say to advance your issues. And so if you have any questions, type them in right now. And if not, I will turn it back over to Andres and the other staff.
Ronnie, thank you so very much. We really appreciate your time and helping us kick off the first of these 4 webinars. I see that we had a couple, or at least one question from Henry already typed in, and we'll get to those in just 1 second, along with David Feynman, along with me. But I just want to do two things. One, if there's one thing you pull away from this is I hope that you can, within your organizations, make sure that when we talk about advocacy, it's not the boogeyman, but it's really something that is vital to what we do and how we're going to win. And the more knowledgeable we are around what is and is not advocacy, and the more comfortable we are using our legally allotted limits, the more successful we're going to be. So encouraging each other to be okay with this, because it's what we need to do to win. Really quick, I wanted to make some of y'all aware of the upcoming webinars. You should have probably registered on this when you saw the email. Please share that email with whoever you want. I would love to fill these next 3 webinars up. Coming up, we have a webinar in a couple weeks on Get Out the Vote and voter engagement campaigns. I think all of us are familiar with all the events that we table at, all the fairs that we go to, all the people we take out on hikes. Now imagine a 70 group Friends Grassroots network, all getting people engaged in voting, helping people register to vote, telling people where they can vote, maybe even driving people to the polls on election day. If we can do that across the Western states as a 70-member organization, we can have a profound impact on our democracy. And that's something that shouldn't be taken lightly, but is also not that difficult. So our next webinar is going to focus on that. Get out the vote, voter engagement, getting people involved. The next webinar, another 2 weeks beyond that, is going to be a little bit more specific on engaging in the political process and engaging with elected representatives or folks who are running for office. The way I like to think about this is showing up at a town hall meeting as a nonprofit conservation group and talking about land issues, elevating the public lands message in any election, all the way from city council to presidential elections. We have a voice and we have a lot of knowledge and passion around our public lands. And I think we would be missing out in this important year if we didn't bring up the public lands message, not just for clean air, clean water, but for the communities that are most affected by it and the cultures that rely on the protection of their land. So this third webinar is really focused on how to engage specifically with candidates, how to ask questions, maybe even going as far as hosting a forum where you invite 2 city council members to have a debate hosted by you, and you can talk about public lands. I know that sounds a little bit scary at times, but especially in local elections, that's how we win. And then the last one is actually a pretty special webinar where if folks have either attended the previous 3 or not, it's called an Ask Me Anything webinar, where folks can actually ask specific strategy and questions such as, hey, we're thinking about doing this event. Are we allowed to do X, Y, and Z? This is a really valuable time if you have specific questions, but also really good to tune in so you can hear what other groups in our network are doing and hopefully be inspired by what's going on 1 state or 2 states over within the same field we all get to work in. So again, we have all these webinars coming up. You can always get a hold of us at any time. I would love to get to Henry's question, but first I want to turn it over to David for a quick moment if you have anything to add, and then we can all jump into Henry and the rest of the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andres, and thanks to all of you for joining today's webinar. And I just wanted to reinforce everything that was discussed on this webinar by sharing a few examples of what members of the network have been and are already doing in regard to advocacy and lobbying in some cases. Just a few examples. Earlier last year, Nicole Croft, when she was with Grand Staircase Escalante Partners, testified in an oversight hearing in the House Natural Resources Committee. California Wilderness Coalition regularly met with the California delegation through the process of advancing the desert legislation that became part of the Dingle Act. Western Slope Conservation Center in Colorado has an annual fly-in where they bring staff and board members to meet with the Colorado delegation. And Conserve Southwest Utah a couple of years ago sent representatives out to meet with their delegation and members of the leadership to kill the Northern Corridor legislation that we're still contending with now, but that was a direct effort to stop legislation that would have authorized that. And over 35 members of the network signed a letter to House and Senate appropriators last year urging increased appropriations for the national conservation lands, and that letter helped to secure a $5 million increase in the appropriations that just passed. So many of you are already doing things that are advocacy. Some of them classify as lobbying because you're asking members to do specific things, but all of it is within the realm of the work that you're able to do as a 501c3 and in no way threatens that status. So we hope through this webinar and others, you'll be encouraged to work with your staff and board to do more of these types of activities. And Andres and I are here to help you facilitate that.
That's great. And I see we have a few questions, so I can help answer them. So I see the first one is about members. And this is interesting. With members, if you're just communicating to your members, which I would say is not really possible if you're talking about Twitter, but if you are doing an email blast, or if you, you can do a newsletter, which some groups do. If you encourage them to contact their legislator, and the communication only goes to your members, it counts as direct lobbying. So you don't have to count it towards your smaller grassroots lobbying limit. So that can be useful. If you are like, as this question asks, educating the membership about and linking to other organizations, that does count as lobbying, but because you actually haven't created that call to action, I would say that your costs are probably really low. There's a little bit of staff time, so I would count that. So, but otherwise, it does count as lobbying because you are still encouraging them to contact their members, but the cost really would be quite low. And definitely, I don't want to discourage anyone. Definitely lobby as much as you can. And let me see what the next one says.
And while you're looking, I would add on to that. If you're going to take that step and make it a call to action, do it. You've already stepped over that line in a wonderful way, in a good way. So go ahead and make it as great as you can. Put in as much information. Don't feel like you have to hold back because you've already opened that door and you're allowed to do it. So I would say if you have something that you feel is a call to action and you're wondering if it's enough, you can always run those things by us. And often what we'll say is, hey, you've opened that door. What else do you need to say? Because now's the time. If you're going to count it well. And these are specific strategies and tactics that we won't get into here, but the Ask Me Anything webinar is a great place to maybe even bring something that you're thinking about doing and we can comment on it, because we would love to know that we're having the maximum effect in this super important year. So, use what you're allowed to use.
So I see I've got a question about lobbying by board members who are essentially acting as volunteers for your organization. So if you're tracking lobbying by expense, then there's no cost to their activities. So you don't need to track it, and they definitely can engage in lobbying for you. And in fact, often this is really effective because I know many organizations look to what we often call grass tops, people who are influential in the community and with legislators. And, like it or not, sometimes they actually have slightly better access and they're a little more influential. So definitely you can have your board members lobby. If you're tracking your lobbying by the insubstantial part test, you do need to somehow, capture that so that you can report that on your 990. And, and this is why I really don't like it, because it's really hard to figure out when free lobbying becomes substantial. But definitely your board members can, and you definitely should have them lobby for you because they are often influential members of the community, and it definitely gets them more involved and invested in the issues that you are supporting and working towards. So definitely your board members are often really great advocates. So let's see, I think we have another one. Let me see if I can get that. The larger report. Oh, so if a larger report or survey includes mention of specific legislation, I think it does that count as lobbying. So I think you need to always go through the elements of lobbying. You know, ask yourself, what is it? You know, does it meet within the exception? First of all, if you're mentioning specific legislation and you're not taking a position, or if you're mentioning specific legislation, it really is nonpartisan analysis, then it doesn't necessarily count as lobbying. So you really just need to go through those lobbying definitions and try to figure out, you know, what is it? Keeping in mind, it's definitely permissible to lobby and often good to do that. So it really does depend. I think if you had something that is, you know, cost you a huge amount of money and you include a lobbying communication in it, there's definitely strategies to break things up into smaller pieces. And that's definitely probably something Andre can help you figure out, how to break things up if something really large is part of a whole lobbying campaign. So I know that's kind of a broad answer, but it really, you know, how you figure these things out really depends on really the facts of what you're doing and what we're talking about. Okay, let's see if I can find the next one. It says, where does my job stop in me as a person? So I would say, you know, if you're being paid to engage in lobbying and, you know, you're on work hours and you're in the Capitol talking to legislators, then you are acting in your work capacity. But definitely we all have a First Amendment right to act as individuals using our own time and our own resources. So definitely if you are working as, you know, an individual, you certainly can express your views. And I know on social media, pretty much everyone has a Twitter account. I would say that separate your personal and your professional lives on your social media. On your personal Twitter account, if you mention your work or if you're highly, you know, if you're the face and voice of your organization, include a disclaimer that makes clear that your tweets are your own. And in that case, then you are acting in your personal capacity and you can talk about candidates and endorse candidates. You can talk about the issues that you care about. And as long as you aren't getting paid to do that, then, you know, you can keep your personal social media page separate and your own and talk about all your own views.
Yeah, and I would add on to this, and maybe David has some thoughts as well, that a lot of our organizations are based in rural towns in the West where it's small community, everybody knows everybody, and often that line of, am I working or am I on my personal time? Am I on the clock and am I doing a personal advocacy message, or, you know, just being able to be very clear. You know, I mean, I think the best example is don't show up wearing a shirt with your organization's name on it. Don't have like your branded backpack and say you're on personal time, just so that you're very clear, I am on my personal time or I'm not. Because in a small community where everybody knows everybody, it's already hard enough. So do yourself a favor and just be very strict about whether you're personal or professional in that moment.
Yeah, and you'll see people doing, I was just going to say, just make clear when you're introducing yourself which capacity you're acting in. And certainly in small communities, people get that everyone wears many hats. We sometimes joke we're going to get C3 hats and C4 hats here so that we can keep it clear. But just make it clear which capacity you're acting in, and that's the best practice.
Yeah, I was just going to add that with all that considered, especially if you're in a small community, even if you make clear that your personal views are being reflected on your social media, those elected officials and staff will still see what you're posting. So they're going to take that into account for how you're representing the nonprofit. So just consider when you share things that even if you disclaim it in a way that doesn't create a tax status issue, it still can affect how those elected officials interpret your perspective on behalf of your nonprofit.
Yeah. And I see I have a question about teaching citizens how to lobby. Does that count as lobbying? So the answer is it really depends. If you're just doing, how to lobby, and we actually have a fact it on our website, How to Lobby. That isn't lobbying. If you're just talking about, set a meeting, designate a spokesperson, have talking points, have a packet. If you're teaching them how to lobby on a specific piece of legislation because you want them, to go lobby, or you're going to do a lobby day, then I would count that as lobbying preparation. So, it depends on how you're conducting that training.
Yeah, and Ronnie and maybe David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would treat the first 3 webinars we're doing as not lobbying at all, because we're just teaching how to get people engaged. The last one, Ask Me Anything, where we may be giving advice or strategy, that's getting closer to that line of when a training could become lobbying. But again, we're going to make sure that we stay on the right side of it, and it's more of a informational. But again, if you're telling people to go vote, that's not lobbying. That's just telling people to be engaged. If you're giving people one-sided information and telling them to vote a certain way, that's definitely lobbying. So, ask us with any more specific.
That's electioneering.
That's electioneering. Sorry, yeah. I should be clear about that. Yeah.
Yeah. But definitely, there's like many ways you can shape how and what you do if you can't lobby. But I would definitely say, lobby as much as your finances allow you to, because taking part in the public policy process is a really important aspect of democracy and being an active, engaged participant.
Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions.
And perfect, because we are 1 minute after the hour. So I would say that we have respected people's 1 hour time block. And since we have no more, I think I will say goodbye to everyone. But just remember that anytime, if you have any other questions, if something occurs to you later on or tomorrow, just reach out to our technical assistance hotline. We are a team of attorneys, and we are all happy to help people figure out how they can be bold and get involved in advocacy.
And one final thing. First, again, thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, David, and everybody else for attending. I'll be sending a follow-up email to everybody who registered for this with a recording, the slides, as well as a link to access our resource library on our website, conservationlands.org, where you can see this and all the previous webinars archived. And feel free to forward this and share it with people within your network as appropriate. I know a lot of folks, it's hard to make the time to attend the webinar, but I would love to make sure that this information gets shared out. So again, if it's a trusted partner or organization in the movement, feel free to share this with them and encourage them to register for future webinars with us. Reach out to me, Andres at conservationlands.org, if you have any questions at all.
Great.
Thank you all very much.
Good talking to everyone. Bye.